Watching live sports is a beautiful thing. For basketball fans, sitting in the lower rows at an NBA game can be an almost religious experience. Problem is, sometimes fans forget players in front of them are real people. There's no invisible barrier separating those who are on the court from those who are off it. Usually, this doesn't mean much more than heckling players or getting your beer knocked all over you, but on rare occasions, much worse has happened. Today, we'll take a look at some of the darkest moments in NBA history. Times when NBA players fought with fans. Vernon Maxwell. One of the most notorious instances of an NBA player fighting a fan happened back in 1995. That year, the Houston Rockets were the best team in the NBA. Michael Jordan had been playing basketball since 1993, and he wouldn't return until close to the end of the following season. This window created by MJ's absence caused a temporary transformation of the entire league. This temporary transformation saw Houston come out on top 2 years in a row. By the time the year 1995 rolled around, they had already won their first NBA championship in '94 and were headed towards their second. The Rockets were led by MVP Hakeem Olajuwon, who had been picked ahead of Michael Jordan in the 1984 draft and was now, finally, for the first and only time, the very best player in the NBA. Looking back now, it's odd that it was during this exact time period, perhaps the brightest in Rockets history, that the team's darkest moment also occurred. Everyone remembers Hakeem Olajuwon, but few remember the player many believe to be his second man, Vernon Maxwell. Maxwell was a starting guard who led the NBA in three-pointers in the early 90s. He also earned himself the intimidating nickname Mad Max. Maxwell was always prone to getting physical and fighting with other players. Also, whenever the Bulls came to town, it was usually Maxwell's job to guard Michael Jordan, something he did with extreme aggression. It wasn't unusual for Maxwell to foul out or get ejected while on defense, which in the 90s is frankly terrifying. Most championship teams need a character like Maxwell. The Warriors have had Draymond Green, the Bulls had Dennis Rodman, the Clippers had Patrick Beverley. Oh wait, they've never won anything. Well, still, he's that type of role player. Having somebody who's fired up to 11 all the time and willing to play rough with opponents is a very valuable thing, as long as they can keep it under control. For the most part, Mad Max was able to, but like most other hot-headed players, he had his moments where he totally lost it. One moment stands out far above the rest. During a regular season game in February 1995, Maxwell and the Rockets were in the process of getting completely blown out by one of their biggest rivals in the West, the Portland Trail Blazers. A few celebrities were in attendance, including Jerry Seinfeld and Bill Gates. The arena in Portland was packed. This was to be one of the last games the Blazers ever played at Veterans Memorial Coliseum. The Moda Center opened just a few months later. Despite suffering a brutal loss, Mad Max decided to live up to his name and walk out of the Coliseum for the first time with a huge bang. To understand how what you're about to see even happened, you have to understand a little bit about how this older arena was laid out. The Veterans Memorial Coliseum was built all the way back in 1960, and it's much smaller and more compact than the modern Moda Center the Blazers play in today. Fans were much closer to the court, and in particular, the players sitting on the bench. If you happen to be the player sitting on the very end of the bench, you're basically surrounded by fans. When you consider this, it's hard to imagine why the Rockets would ever allow their most hot-headed player to sit on the end of the bench in a rival arena. After all, his nickname wasn't Mellow Max. This would prove to be a mistake that would cost not only the team, but the entire sport in the long run. It all started when an argument broke out between Maxwell and somebody in the stands nearby. Most people were paying attention to the game, and few noticed this at first. Nobody knows for sure what started it, but there have at least been rumors from people who claim to have been there that something was said about Vernon Maxwell's daughter. Whatever was said, it wasn't going over well. The argument continued to heat up. Maxwell offered the suggestion that the fan kiss his ass. This failed to solve their disagreement. Maxwell also started arguing with his own teammates who were pleading for him to calm down. Instead of calming down, Maxwell decided to do one of the most striking things you'll ever see on a basketball videotape. Casually and slowly, he got up and started walking up the stairs towards the fan. A balding 120-pound security officer saw what was happening but failed to do anything and almost certainly couldn't have done much anyway. The fan, who must have been a total idiot, can be seen staring back at Maxwell with a highly punchable, fat, annoying face. It was just too much for Mad Max to resist. Teammates of Maxwell's, including Robert Ory and Kenny the Jet Smith, came rushing to the rescue, but ultimately, the damage had been done. This shocking moment destroyed Maxwell's reputation, and it cost the NBA a lot in terms of public perception. Maxwell was also suspended for 10 games and fined $20,000. It was like something in Mad Max had permanently snapped. This moment in Portland marked a new pattern that would haunt the remainder of his career. Just a week or two later, Portland's star guard, Clyde Drexler, was traded to Houston. This turned one of Vernon's biggest rivals into his newest teammate. Drexler is a Hall of Famer, and for the most part, everybody in Houston was thrilled about the trade, but not Mad Max. He saw it as a threat to his own standing with the team. In April of 1995, Maxwell faked an injury because he was frustrated with how little playing time he was getting. How he thought being on the injured list would increase his playing time, I have no idea. But whatever his plan was, it backfired. The Rockets fired Maxwell after they found out his injury had been a stunt. Maxwell ended up signing with the Philadelphia 76ers shortly after. Initially, this looked like a promising new home for the guard, but considering how insecure he got about having to share his position with Clyde Drexler, you can imagine how he would have felt about the guard Philly drafted in '96, Allen Iverson. But Maxwell never made it that far. He was arrested for reckless driving and drug possession and found himself extradited to Houston, where he served a 90-day jail sentence. You may also see the name Mad Max come up again in a future video about more NBA players who went to jail. Maxwell spent the rest of his career bouncing around the NBA. In 2000, while playing with the Seattle Supersonics, Mad Max got in another brawl, this time with the team star, Gary Payton. Once again, Maxwell was finding it difficult to coexist with other guards who were better than he was. Multiple injuries resulted from this fight, and both Maxwell and Payton were fined. Mad Max finally retired in 2001. Despite being a two-time NBA champion and spending the prime of his career alongside some of the greatest players of all time, his career is forever tarnished by his behavior. If he's remembered at all, it'll probably be as the NBA player who punched a fan back in 1995. Ron Artest. The only other example of an NBA player fighting a fan is much more well known, but there might be some surprising details you don't know. The Malice at the Palace in 2004 is one of the most infamous moments in all of sports, and as with any moment like it, there's as much misinformation as there is information. Most NBA fans are familiar with the story itself. If you're not familiar, then definitely check out our video, Best NBA Fights and Ejections of All Time. We cover it in detail. The short version is that a fight broke out between the Indiana Pacers and the defending champion Detroit Pistons during a regular season game in Detroit. At first, the brawl was fairly normal as far as NBA brawls go, but things took a turn for the worse when Pacers forward Ron Artest, widely regarded to be the person who started the brawl with a hard foul on Ben Wallace and widely regarded to be the craziest goddamn dude to ever be in the NBA, charged into the stands. This shocking moment caught even the seasoned announcers totally off guard. It had an ominous resemblance to Vernon Maxwell a decade prior, only this time, Artest wasn't walking. He was running, full speed. Reggie Miller was finishing up his last season with the Pacers, and he remembers watching exactly what happened. Artest, who already had a serious reputation for anger issues, had started out by doing the right thing. Even though he had probably started the fight, Artest initially tried to distance himself and calm down, lying on his back across the scorer's table. This is apparently something the Pacers had asked Artest to start doing during situations like this so as to avoid him having an outburst. But damn did it backfire. According to Miller, he saw a red Solo cup flipping through the air towards Artest. He remembers it like it was in slow motion. Miller says he knew immediately this meant disaster. Artest might actually deserve more credit than he got. Even though it was probably difficult, he was doing the right thing and calming himself down. It's just unfortunate that at this exact moment, he got hit with a cup full of liquid from the stands. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't beer in the cup, but Diet Coke. The cup was thrown by a man named John Green. Artest didn't see who threw it, but in a rage, he was convinced that it must have been another man who was near Green, a man named Michael Ryan. Ryan may or may not have been truly innocent during the situation, but he definitely didn't throw the drink, and he definitely didn't deserve the 6'7", 260-pound sucker punch he got. Not only did Artest punch a fan, he punched the wrong fan. Another detail that is often forgotten is that Artest wasn't the only Pacers player to punch a fan during the brawl. Steven Jackson also punched a fan. He followed Artest into the stands and punched another man named William Paulson. It's unknown whether Paulson threw any drinks, but it's quite possible that two innocent fans both got punched during the same 30-second sequence. Artest is usually remembered as the player who charged into the stands, but in the end, A whole host of players from both teams ended up in the stands, some trying to break up the fighting, some trying to keep it going. The worst injury of the evening was actually given to the Pacers radio broadcaster, a man named Mark Boyle. Boyle, for some suicidal reason, tried to jump in front of Artest when Artest first began charging into the stands. Boyle got completely trampled, and he suffered 5 fractured vertebrae and a serious gash on his head. Artest is also remembered as punching one fan, but that evening, he actually punched 2. After Artest finally left the stands, to everyone's relief, he was confronted on the court by 2 Pistons fans. One was named Alvin Shackelford. Maybe Shackelford was the more confrontational of the 2 fans, or maybe Artest randomly chose him. But either way, Artest absolutely clobbered Shackelford. The punch was so powerful, it knocked both Shackelford and his companion, a man named Charlie Haddad, off their feet and onto the hardwood. This led to a brief moment nobody remembers, but which may have been the most dangerous of the entire event and probably in NBA history. While Shackelford and Haddad were lying vulnerable on the floor, Jermaine O'Neal ran up and joined Artest in punching and attacking the 2 men. O'Neal also slipped and fell over. At that point, the whole court was covered in beer and soda and trash from the stands. Multiple people who were there, including ESPN sideline reporter Jim Gray, said they thought at that moment that Jermaine O'Neal and Ron Artest were actually going to kill the 2 men. It is believed that, had the other Pacers and various people not been able to quickly pull Artest and O'Neal away and towards the locker room, they may have. This means the NBA came within inches of witnessing a player not only fight with the fan, but actually murder them. Who knows how that would have changed the future of the NBA? Thankfully, it didn't happen, but there were still some dramatic changes that took place immediately after the Malice at the Palace that have stayed ever since. One is that security has been significantly beefed up. Another is that alcohol sales are limited much more strictly. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and nothing like it has happened since. But it's important to remember, it still could. At the end of the day, nothing can stop an NBA player who has truly lost his mind with rage. NBA players are just about the worst people to send into that state because they are generally the largest, most athletic people alive. 99.9% of people would get absolutely pummeled, and of course, under certain circumstances, they could even get killed. The league hasn't seen a player quite as deranged as Ron Artest in a while, but in general, it doesn't seem like NBA players are getting calmer or less prone to fighting. Violence still breaks out during NBA games, and fans are still stupid enough to get involved, or even start the fights to begin with. What would a Malice at the Palace 2.0 look like in the age of Instagram and TikTok? We'd get to see the events from every angle. Maybe, if that had been the case back in 2004, we'd have a different understanding of what went down that fateful evening in Auburn Hills.